If you pay attention to sermon titles, know that the title I have given to my sermon today, rather than the one printed in the bulletin, is to close the eyes. One of the wonderful things about stories is that they can be interpreted in more than one way. And that is certainly true of the Hebrew story of origins that Gail read for us this morning. The part of the story that we read attempts to give an explanation of why it is that we human beings find ourselves outside the garden, in a world that includes fragility and suffering and death. The storyteller imagines a time when there was a beautiful garden of paradise, and human beings were right in the middle of it. An idyllic world in which nothing ever died or needed anything. There was no fragility or suffering or death. According to what has become the predominant Christian interpretation of this story, Adam and Eve, the first two mythical humans, were cast out of this idyllic garden because they disobeyed God in order to be like God, in order to have God's powers of self-sufficiency and control. God told Adam and Eve not to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. The tempter told this first human pair that if they ate of the tree, they'd be like God. And Adam and Eve took the bait. And as this predominant interpretation goes, God cast these first humans out of the garden because of their disobedience and their presumptive arrogance to suppose they could be like God. As this interpretation goes, the root sin of humanity is pride. And pride always goes before a fall. And oh, how they did fall. But I wondered. I was talking about this story with a colleague recently as we were moaning about sermon preparation. And she said to me, maybe this is a story about human inquisitiveness. And I thought, now there's a very interesting idea. The storyteller says that the forbidden tree was the tree of knowledge. And when Adam and Eve ate from it, the storyteller says that their eyes were opened. Doesn't sound like such a bad thing, does it? To have open eyes. Isn't it a natural and good part of human nature to want to know more about the world that we inhabit? Isn't that partly why we're here? And isn't it also true that the more we know, the more challenges we seem to face as to the proper and just and healthy use of our knowledge? Maybe this is a story about the uncomfortable tension that we human beings face as creatures who have both the capacity to explore and to take in and learn from our environment, only to find that then we struggle to know what to do with what we now know. It's a responsibility that sometimes enables humans to discover ways to relieve great suffering. And at other times, it enables us to cause great suffering. It's a big responsibility that may sometimes feel like a gift and sometimes very much like a burden, if not even a punishment. It's a responsibility that may leave us wishing sometimes that we were back in the garden where God took care of everything for us. I wonder. Rabbi Mark Gelman has written a delightfully provocative collection of stories about some of the stories in the Bible that he called, "Does God Have a Big Toe?" I love what he does with this story about the garden. Rabbi Gelman tells his story about that story this way. The Garden of Eden had everything. Bears and monkeys, fish and butterflies, everything. Even the first man and woman, Adam and Eve, were there. Nothing ever died in the garden, so of course nothing was ever born to replace it either. The Garden of Eden had everything, but everything was always just the same. One day, Adam and Eve came upon a crack in the big wall that surrounded the garden. Looking through the crack, they saw in the brown dust outside the garden a tomato plant was growing. At first, they could hardly recognize it. In the garden, all the tomato plants were tall and full and green, with many big red tomatoes on each and every stem. What they saw through the crack in the wall was a puny, shriveled up little thing with just one tiny green tomato barely hanging on to one of the stems. Every day, Adam and Eve would come to the crack and peep through to see how the only thing growing outside of the garden was doing. One day, the little tomato plant drooped over and turned brown. Adam looked at Eve and said, "It never looked good, but now it looks worse." Eve looked at Adam and said, "Whatever could have happened to it?" They sat there for a long time, peeping through the crack in the wall at the little tomato that had drooped over and turned brown. After a long while, God spoke to them, saying, "The tomato plant is dead." God could have been a bit more pastoral in that. The tomato plant is dead. And Adam and Eve cried. They asked God, "Why did it have to die? Nothing dies here in the garden." But God would not answer this question, no matter how many times they asked. So they became angry at God. They demanded that God let them out of the Garden of Eden so they could take care of that little tomato plant. God said to them, "You can leave, but you can't come back." Well, Adam and Eve got up and walked right out of the garden and right over to that little tomato plant that had drooped over and turned brown. Inside the garden, nothing needed help. Outside the garden, everything needed help. And so they were not sorry that they could not return. Adam picked up the tiny green tomato, and Eve planted it in the brown dust of the earth. For many days they watered the ground and kept the weeds away, and they waited. And then it happened. A green shoot poked up through the dusty ground. And in a few days, it became a tomato plant. Full and green with many big red tomatoes on each stem. In the days that followed, when the man and the woman looked at the strong new tomato plant, they would also think of the scraggly little plant that they had once peeked at through the crack in the wall. It was a funny feeling. They were happy and sad at the very same time. And I wonder, in some ways, Rabbi Gelman's interpretive story about the story of Adam and Eve ends up in the very same place as the predominant Christian interpretation. The first humans end up outside the garden. They have lost paradise. They have lost the security of a life in which their needs were always cared for, before they even noticed that they had any needs, only to find themselves in a world of fragility, with the potential for suffering and the inevitability of death. But in Rabbi Gelman's interpretation, they end up outside the garden for very different reasons. In the predominant Christian interpretation, the first humans end up outside the garden because they're being punished for trying to be like God. In Rabbi Gelman's interpretation, they are outside the garden because they chose to open their eyes. They chose to open their eyes to the fullness of creation, and what they saw touched them deeply. It engendered in them a sense of compassion and a desire to nurture and help. And they chose to water that desire rather than stay in the security of the garden where nothing at all needed their help. So I wonder, maybe this story of origins in Genesis is really a coming-of-age story. Maybe like teenagers pushing the limits so that they can learn more about who they are apart from their parents. This story is about humanity's need to grow up and mature and to think about something beyond their own immediate needs. Ironically, in leaving the garden, they actually did become like God, imitating the divine yearning to offer compassion and nurture and help to creatures like you and me and tomato plants. Ironically, it may have been the temptation to keep their eyes closed and stay and preserve their own perfection and well-being that may have been the most dangerous temptation of all. Perhaps leaving the garden was a courageous and selfless choice, a choice that you and I are called on to make again and again and again. Perhaps when Adam and Eve stomped out of the garden in self-righteous indignation in order to care for that little tiny tomato plant, perhaps instead of being angry, God actually smiled. I wonder,